Welcome to another thrilling story. Today I'm going to tell you a story that transports us to Brazil in 1884, 4 years before the abolition of slavery, an era of profound transformations where honor was still worth more than gold and where a deathbed promise could change the destiny of generations. This is the story of a barefoot boy who dared to claim not just a piece of land, but the fulfillment of a given word. A narrative about dignity, courage, and how true bonds are built not by blood but by mutual respect. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that touch the heart and make us reflect on eternal values, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing these special narratives. Year 1884. Location: interior of Minas Gerais, Boa Esperança farm region. The deathbed promise. The wind whispered through the leaves of the jambo tree when Benedito discovered that he carried in his hands much more than a letter yellowed by time. It was a June morning in 1884, and the fine drizzle that fell over the interior of Minas Gerais seemed to bless the red earth with its silver tears. Dona Rosa, his grandmother, watched the 9-year-old boy through the window of the adobe cottage, her weathered hands caressing the paper she had kept as a relic for the past months. Benedito's eyes, large and curious like two brown stars, gazed at the old washerwoman and healer with the intensity of one who senses that life is about to take a different course. "My boy," murmured Dona Rosa, her voice carrying the weight of 58 years of life and all the longing for her deceased husband. "It's time for you to know why your grandfather Sebastião died with a broken heart." The silence of the house embraced the two figures. Outside, the melancholic song of the great Kiskadi echoed among the distant coffee plantations of Boa Esperança farm, as if nature itself knew it would witness the moment when a barefoot boy would discover that his inheritance was not made of gold, but of a given word. Benedito sat on the packed earth floor, his bare feet crossed, waiting. Dona Rosa unfolded the letter with the delicacy of one handling dried petals, and her voice trembled as she began to tell the story that would forever change her grandson's destiny. "Your grandfather worked 45 years as foreman of Colonel Firmino's coffee plantations. 45 years, Bento. He saw 3 generations born and raised on this land. And when the colonel was on his deathbed last January, he called Sebastião and made a promise." The boy leaned forward, like a flower turning toward the sun. "A promise that became this letter, boy. The colonel promised that the plot near the spring, the one in the valley, would be yours when you grew up. There were witnesses, Father Antonio, Judge Valerio, and Compadre Domingo. They all saw. They all heard. The words floated in the air like golden butterflies, carrying dreams and possibilities that Benedito could not yet fully understand. Dona Rosa extended the letter to her grandson, and when their fingers touched, it was as if an invisible chain linked past and future. "But why did grandfather die with a broken heart?" asked Benedito, his small voice echoing in the silent house. "Because Colonel Firmino died in January, and his son Ignacio took over the farm. And the promises of the dead boy sometimes get buried with them." As Benedito held the letter against his chest, something ignited in his eyes. It wasn't just childish curiosity, but a different flame, ancient and powerful. It was dignity awakening, like a sprout breaking through hard earth in search of light. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, and each drop that touched the thatched roof seemed to whisper a question that would echo through the next chapters of this story. Would a barefoot boy have the courage to collect on a promise from a colonel? The dawn of the next day brought with it a silent determination that transformed Benedito's countenance. Dona Rosa watched her grandson prepare for what she knew would be a journey much greater than the simple 2-hour walk to Boa Esperança farm. The boy put on his only alpargatas, those he saved for Sundays and special occasions, and carefully folded the letter, storing it in the pocket of his raw cotton shirt. His movements had a solemnity that contrasted with his age, as if each gesture had been rehearsed by generations of ancestors who had also faced giants with only truth as their shield. "You don't need to go today, boy," whispered Dona Rosa, but her own words sounded empty. She knew, as wise women know, that there are moments in life when destiny knocks at the door and won't accept a tomorrow for an answer. Benedito kissed his grandmother's forehead, and in that simple gesture was all the tenderness in the world. Then, with firm steps that left footprints in the damp earth, he began his walk. The path wound between hills covered with coffee plantations, where the still green beans shone like small emeralds under the rising sun. The smell of wet earth mixed with the sweet aroma of coffee in bloom, creating an olfactory symphony that accompanied the boy's steps. Benedito walked in silence, but his thoughts flew like restless birds. He imagined the meeting, the words he would say, the expression on Colonel Ignacio's face. He had heard about the man, a fellow with a thick moustache and hard eyes, who had inherited not only his father's lands, but also his reputation as a man of his word. The farm gate appeared like a majestic vision at the end of the road, black wrought iron contrasting with stone pillars, and beyond it, the big house rose imposingly, with its colored glass windows catching and fragmenting the morning light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Manuel, the gate guard, frowned when he saw the boy approaching. He was a middle-aged man with skin weathered by the sun and the suspicious look of one who had spent his life protecting others' property. "What do you want here, little rascal?" he asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. Benedito raised his chin, and in that simple moment, Donna Rosa would have recognized in her grandson the same silent dignity of the late Sebastião. "I came to speak with Colonel Ignacio. I have an important matter to discuss with him." Manuel laughed, but his laughter sounded forced, as if something in the boy's posture bothered him. "Important matter? You? Get out of here, boy, before I call the dogs." It was then that a deep and measured voice was heard from the other side of the gate. "Let the boy in, Manuel." Zeferino approached, his tall, thin figure cutting through the morning like a blade of light. A former slave freed just months ago, he now worked as a free man in the coffee plantations, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of one who knew deeply the weight of injustices and the value of opportunities. "I know this boy," said Zeferino, studying Benedito's face. "He's Sebastião's grandson. Good man, honest worker. If the boy came here, he must have his reasons." Manuel hesitated, but something in Zeferino's silent authority made him open the gate. Benedito entered, his bare feet touching for the first time the ground of the property that had consumed 45 years of his grandfather's life. As they walked along the avenue of imperial palms toward the big house, Zeferino observed the boy with growing curiosity. There was something in that child that reminded him of the great men he had known, a natural dignity that cannot be learned but is born with, like birds are born knowing how to fly. "What do you have to say to the colonel, boy?" asked Zeferino, his voice gentle but investigative. Benedito touched the pocket where he kept the letter, and his answer came loaded with a conviction that made Zeferino stop walking. "I came to collect on a promise, Mr. Zeferino, a promise that my grandfather died waiting to see fulfilled." In that moment, as the wind made the palm leaves whisper and the sun rose majestically over Boa Esperança farm, Zeferino knew he was witnessing the birth of something extraordinary. It wasn't just a boy walking beside him, but justice itself taking human form, small and barefoot, but irresistible like the current of a river in the rainy season. The big house rose before them, and with it, the moment that would define whether the promises of the dead can survive in the world of the living. The echo of Benedito's steps on the wide plank porch floor sounded like drums announcing a silent battle. The windows of the big house reflected the golden morning, but behind them, shadows moved with the restlessness of those who sense that routine is about to be broken. Zeferino knocked on the door with 3 firm raps, and soon the solid wood opened to reveal a young maid with curious eyes. Without words, she led them through corridors adorned with jacaranda furniture and portraits of ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to follow the steps of the intruding boy. Colonel Ignacio was in his office, bent over accounting books that recorded the wealth of the coffee plantations. At 45 years old, he was an imposing man with a thick mustache and eyes that carried the weight of responsibility for maintaining an empire built by his father. When he looked up and saw Benedito, a wrinkle of astonishment creased his forehead. "Who is this boy, Zeferino?" "He's Sebastião's grandson, Colonel. Says he has an important matter to discuss with you." Ignacio leaned back in his leather chair, studying the small figure before him. There was something in Benedito's posture that intrigued him, a strange combination of humility and determination that was not often seen in adults, much less in children. "Speak, boy, what brings you here?" Benedito took the letter from his pocket with careful movements, like one handling something sacred. His small hands trembled slightly, but his voice came out firm and clear. "My grandfather Sebastião worked 45 years for your father, Colonel Firmino. Before dying, the colonel made a promise. This letter is the proof." Ignacio took the yellowed paper, and his eyebrows rose as he recognized his father's handwriting. He read silently, and with each line, his expression transformed. It was indeed Firmino's writing, the signature he had known since childhood, the words that carried the weight of a deathbed promise. At that moment, Hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor. Donna Isabel entered the office like a sudden storm, her blonde hair still disheveled from the morning, her green eyes sparkling with irritation. At 32 years old, she was a beautiful and proud woman, mother of 3 young children, and accustomed to being absolute lady of her domain. "What is this meeting without my presence, Ignacio? And who is this boy in our house?" The colonel extended the letter to her without words. Isabel read quickly, and her face paled before taking on reddish tones of indignation. "This is absurd," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the corridors. "The lands of the Spring Valley are the most productive of the entire farm. They are the inheritance of our children, João, Rita, and little Antonio." Benedito remained motionless, like a small oak tree facing a gale. His eyes did not waver from Isabel's face, and in them was a serenity that contrasted dramatically with the woman's agitation. "The lands were promised to my grandfather for me," he said, his voice low but firm. "There were witnesses, Father Antonio, Judge Valerio, and Compadre Domingo." Isabel laughed bitterly. "Witnesses? And where are these witnesses now? The priest is in his church, the judge in his house, and Compadre Domingo, well, we all know he drinks too much to be a reliable witness to anything." Ignacio raised his hand, asking for silence. His eyes alternated between the letter and the boy, and something in his expression revealed an inner struggle. As a man of honor, he recognized the document's authenticity. As a landowner and father, he understood his wife's fury. "This is not a matter to be decided in the heat of the moment," he finally declared. "I need time to think, to consult prudent people." 10 days, said Benedito, and his voice carried a maturity that surprised everyone present. "My grandfather waited 45 years. I can wait 10 days. Isabel opened her mouth to protest, but Ignacio silenced her with a look. There was something about that boy that impressed him. Not just the courage to come alone to collect on a promise, but the dignity with which he faced the situation. 10 days, then, agreed the colonel. "Return here next Saturday. I will have an answer for you." Benedito made a small bow, retrieved the letter from Ignacio's hands, and headed to the door, accompanied by Zeffirino. His steps sounded different now, no longer those of an anxious boy, but of someone who had planted a seed and would wait patiently to see if it would germinate. When the door closed behind him, the silence that settled in the office was thick as honey. Isabel paced back and forth, her skirts whispering against the wooden floor, while Ignacio remained motionless, looking through the window at the coffee plantations that stretched to the horizon. "You can't be seriously thinking of giving those lands to that boy," Isabel exploded. Ignacio sighed deeply. "I recognize my father's handwriting, Isabel, and I also recognize that Sebastian was a faithful man throughout his life. If my father made that promise—" "But think of our children," she interrupted. "Think of their future." Ignacio turned to his wife, and in his eyes was a storm of conflicting emotions. "I am thinking of them, Isabel. I'm thinking about what it means to be a man of honor in a changing world, and I'm thinking about whether I want them to grow up, knowing that their father broke their grandfather's given word." The wind blew through the open windows, bringing with it the aroma of the coffee plantations and something more, perhaps the faint perfume of approaching changes, of destinies intertwining, of promises demanding to be fulfilled. And while Benedito walked back home, his bare feet touching the earth that might soon be his, the sun rose high in the sky of Minas Gerais, illuminating a story that was still far from over. The 10 days that followed passed like slow clouds over the farm. Colonel Ignacio did not sleep well, tossing and turning in the double bed while Isabel sighed beside him, and mornings found him on the porch, contemplating the coffee plantations with the eyes of one carrying heavy decisions in his heart. During this time, he sought out Father Antonio, a man with white hair and kind eyes who confirmed having witnessed the deathbed promise. He also visited Dr. José Bento, the family lawyer, who examined the letter and declared its authenticity. Even Compadre Domingo, despite his reputation as a drunkard, clearly remembered that rainy January when Firmino had made his last will. Isabel did not remain idle. She sent letters to relatives in São João del Rei, speculating about the possibility of returning there with the children. She also received a visit from Candido Pereira, a wealthy merchant from Santos, interested in buying land for export coffee cultivation. "That valley is worth a fortune," whispered Candido, his small eyes gleaming with greed. "If you sell, I can offer 200 contos de reis, enough money to educate your children in Europe." Benedito, during those days, helped Donna Rosa with the clothes she washed in the creek, but his eyes constantly turned toward the direction of the farm. He didn't speak about what had happened, but his grandmother perceived the tension in his small shoulders, the way he caressed the letter every night before sleeping. "You did what you had to do, boy," she murmured, while running her hand through her grandson's curly hair. "Now we just have to wait." Saturday arrived with a clear and fresh morning. Benedito woke before the sun, bathed in the creek with special care, and put on his best clothes, raw cotton pants mended at the knees, and a white shirt that Donna Rosa had washed with special care. The walk to the farm seemed shorter this time, perhaps because destiny, when it finally reveals itself, is eager to reach us. Zeffirino awaited him at the gate, an enigmatic smile on his dark face. "The colonel is waiting for you, boy." And he's not alone. In the office, Benedito found a small crowd. Colonel Ignacio stood behind the desk, Isabel seated in a high-backed chair, the three young children playing quietly in a corner. Also present was scribe Joaquim, who had come especially from the village, and Candido Pereira, who observed everything with calculating eyes. Ignacio cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried the solemnity of a sentence. "Benedito, son of Sebastio, grandson of one who served this family honorably for 45 years. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the birds outside seemed to have stopped singing. "My father's promise will be fulfilled." Isabel closed her eyes and sighed deeply, but did not protest. Candido Pereira muttered something inaudible and pressed his lips together. "4 alcaires of land in the Spring Valley will be transferred to your name," Ignacio continued. "Zeffirino will be in charge of helping you in the first months until you learn to work the land alone." Scribe Joaquim opened his record book and began to write with careful handwriting. The scratching of the pen on paper sounded like celestial music to Benedito. "Why only 4 alcaires?" asked Candido Pereira. "The letter mentions 5. Ignacio looked directly at Benedito. "Because 1 alcaire will remain with the family, ensuring that the spring continues to supply all the neighboring properties. I believe this is fair for everyone." Benedito nodded slowly. In his eyes was gratitude, but also understanding that true generosity sometimes requires mutual sacrifices. When the documents were signed and sealed, Ignacio approached the boy and extended his hand. "Welcome to the family of landowners, Benedito. Use this land well." The handshake was firm, and in that moment 2 generations met, the colonel recognizing in the boy the same upright character of the grandfather, and Benedito discovering that not all powerful people are insensitive to justice. Isabel rose from her chair, gathered her children, and headed to the door. Before leaving, she stopped and looked at Benedito. "Take good care of the spring, boy. It fed my children when they were babies." There was something in her voice, not exactly kindness, but perhaps the beginning of a resignation that could, in time, transform into something better. When Benedito left the big house, the sun was high and golden. Zeffirino walked beside him, and for the first time since arriving at the farm, the ex-slave smiled openly. "You did it, boy. You achieved what many grown men wouldn't have the courage to attempt." Benedito looked back once, seeing the big house silhouetted against the blue sky, then turned his face forward. His lands awaited him. His future awaited him. And somewhere, in the invisible realm where the dead dwell, Sebastião could finally rest in peace. The promise had been fulfilled, but the story, Benedito knew instinctively, was just beginning. 3 years poured over the Spring Valley like golden honey over fresh bread. Benedito, now 12 years old, had grown not just in stature but in wisdom. His hands, once small and uncertain, had learned the secrets of the red earth, and the 4 alcaires flourished under his care like a blessed garden. The coffee plantations he had planted bore their first red fruits, gleaming like small jewels among the green leaves. Corn and beans alternated in orderly rows, creating a mosaic of colors that changed with the seasons. The crystalline spring continued to bubble from the stone like an eternal tear, feeding not only Benedito's plantations, but 8 families of small farmers who had settled in the surroundings. Donna Rosa, now 61 years old, spent her afternoons on the porch of the new little house that Benedito had built. 2 rooms, 2 bedrooms, and a wood-burning stove kitchen, with large windows that embraced the morning light. Her tired but proud eyes followed her grandson's movement among the plantations, and she often murmured to herself, "Sebastião, wherever you are, you can see that your boy honored your name." It was on a March afternoon, when the heat danced in waves over the coffee plantations, that Candido Pereira returned. He arrived in a black carriage pulled by 2 horses, wearing a fine linen suit and a wide-brimmed hat. His belly had grown along with his fortune, and the gold rings on his fingers caught the sunlight like small beacons of greed. "Benedito!" he shouted from atop the carriage, without bothering to get down. "I have a proposal for you, boy." Benedito was drawing water from the spring, his pants rolled up to his knees. He rose slowly, studying the merchant with eyes that had learned to read men's intentions. 200,000 race, announced Candido, as if offering the kingdom of heaven. "That's what I'm offering for your lands. Enough money for you to live like a prince in any big city." Benedito dried his hands on his shirt and approached the carriage. When he spoke, his voice carried the same serenity that had impressed Colonel Ignacio 3 years before. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Candido, but my land is not for sale." The merchant laughed, but his laughter sounded forced. "Don't be foolish, boy. What do you understand about business? 200,000 rays is a fortune. I understand enough to know that some treasures cannot be bought or sold," replied Benedito, and his words floated in the hot air like butterflies of wisdom. Candido departed in a cloud of dust, grumbling about the stubbornness of youth. But Benedito had already forgotten the incident, absorbed in the task of checking whether the corn plants needed water. It was shortly after, in April, that Donna Isabel fell ill. Malarial fevers came like an invisible storm, leaving her bedridden for weeks. The 3 children, João at 9 years old, Rita at 7, and Antonio at 5, wandered through the big house like little ghosts, while Colonel Ignacio alternated between despair and prayer. The news reached Benedito through Zeferino, who was now his partner and friend. The ex-slave found the boy fixing a fence, and after telling about Isabel's illness, was surprised by Benedito's reaction. "I'm going to find my grandmother," the boy said simply. "She knows plants that can help." Donna Rosa heard the request attentively, then walked to her yard of medicinal herbs. Her expert hands gathered boldo leaves, purple ipe bark, and chamomile flowers. She prepared a special tea, seasoned with wild honey, and a pinch of that ancient wisdom that only healers possess. "Take this to the lady," she told Benedito, "and tell her she must drink 3 cups a day, always warm, never cold." Benedito carried the clay pot to the farm as if carrying sacred water. In the kitchen of the big house, he found the servants in panic, and the colonel pale with worry. "It's a tea my grandmother prepared," Benedito explained. "She knows the secrets of plants." Ignacio looked at the pot like a man grasping the last plank in a shipwreck. He personally climbed to his wife's room, where Isabel was delirious with high fever, her golden hair stuck to her pale forehead. "Isabel," he murmured, carefully lifting her head. "The boy brought medicine. Will you take it for me?" In the days that followed, something miraculous happened. The fever dropped, the delirium ceased, and Isabel slowly returned to the world of the living. It was as if Donna Rosa's plants had called back a soul that was already walking toward the other side. When Isabel finally came down to the ground floor, supported by her husband's arm, she found Benedito in the garden, playing with her 3 children. Joan was trying to teach him to shoot with a slingshot. Rita was showing him flowers she had picked, and little Antonio had simply hung from the boy's arm like a playful little monkey. Isabel stopped on the porch, observing the scene. There was something in that picture that touched a sensitive chord in her heart, perhaps the simplicity of childish joy, or perhaps the memory of how close she had come to leaving those children motherless. "Benedito," she called, and her voice came out different, softer. The boy approached, and for the first time since they had met, Isabel truly looked at him, not as an intruder or threat, but as a person. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your grandmother saved my life." Benedito made a small bow. "She said it was God's will, Donna Isabel. The plants just obey." In that moment, as the afternoon sun gilded the garden and the children played around them, something changed forever at Boa Esperanza farm. It was as if an invisible bridge had been built between 2 worlds that seemed destined to remain separate. Isabel extended her hand to Benedito, and when he took it, it was as if she touched for the first time the hand of the boy who had saved her life, and no longer that of the intruder who had threatened her patrimony. "I would like to learn about these plants," she said, "and perhaps you would like to learn other things too." Benedito smiled, and his smile was like sun breaking through clouds. From that day on, the afternoons at Boa Esperanza farm would gain a different flavor. Isabel teaching letters and numbers to the boy from the valley, and he sharing the secrets of medicinal plants he had learned from his grandmother. It was the beginning of a friendship that would grow like Donna Rosa's plants, slowly but with deep roots, capable of resisting all storms. The years flowed over the region like a gentle river, carrying transformations that Benedito observed with the eyes of one who had learned to read the signs of the times. The abolition of slavery came in 1888, when he was 13 years old, bringing changes that echoed throughout Boa Esperança farm like ripples on a tranquil lake. Zeferino, already free for years, officially became foreman of the freed workers, and his experience helped in the smooth transition to wage labor. Benedito, growing between two worlds, the humble one of his origin and the prosperous one of his lands, developed a special sensitivity to understand everyone's needs. At 15 years old, he was already a young man of elegant bearing, with the serene dignity of his grandfather and the practical wisdom of his grandmother. His coffee plantations produced beans of exceptional quality, which he sold directly to merchants in the capital. Bringing profits, he invested wisely, part in expanding the plantations, part in savings that grew month by month in the village bank. Isabel had fulfilled her promise to teach him letters, and Benedito had not only learned to read and write fluently, but had developed a taste for the books she lent from the library of the big house. He read Machado de Assis on Sunday afternoons, and his reflections on the stories impressed the improvised teacher. "You have a privileged mind, Benedito," Isabel would say, watching him solve math problems with natural ease. "You could study in the capital, become a doctor or lawyer." But Benedito would just smile and shake his head. "My place is here, Donna Isabel. The land teaches me everything I need to know." In 1895, at 20 years old, Benedito met Maria das Dores during the village's St. John's festival. She was the schoolmaster's daughter, an 18-year-old girl with sweet eyes and skillful hands for sewing and embroidery. The courtship was discreet and respectful, conducted under Donna Rosa's approving gaze and with the blessing of Colonel Ignacio himself. The wedding took place in the small village church on an October morning, perfumed with jasmine. Isabel insisted on lending her wedding dress, a gesture that symbolized the complete transformation of her relationship with Benedito. Donna Rosa, at 70 years old, cried with joy seeing her grandson exchange rings made with gold extracted from his own lands. The house that Benedito built for Maria das Dores was on a gentle hill from where the entire valley could be seen. It was a solid construction of brick and clay tiles, with a wide porch and large windows that embraced the light. In the yard, Maria das Dores planted a garden that rivaled in beauty that of the big house. But life also brought its sadnesses. Donna Rosa died peacefully in 1897, on a winter morning when mist embraced the valley like a bridal veil. Benedito found her in her favorite chair on the porch, a serene smile on her lips, as if she had departed while conversing with invisible angels. The funeral gathered people from the entire region. Isabel came with the 3 children, now grown, João at 15 beginning to help his father in farm administration, Rita at 13 developing the same natural elegance as her mother, and Antonio at 11 showing aptitude for studies. "She was like a second mother to me," said Isabel, placing flowers on the grave. "She taught me that wisdom doesn't come from books, but from the heart." In 1899, it was Colonel Ignacio's turn to depart. A sudden pneumonia took him in a premature autumn, leaving a sealed letter that should only be opened after his funeral. Benedito was among those who carried the coffin, and his tears mixed with those of João, who at 17 would assume the responsibility of running the farm. The letter, read by lawyer Dr. José Bento, revealed one last surprise. To young Benedito, son of the heart, who honored the memory of his grandfather Sebastião, "I leave him 2 more alqueires of the Spring Valley so that his property may be complete. May he continue being an example of character and dignity for my children and grandchildren." Isabel did not protest. She had learned over the years that some inheritances transcend blood and are based on merit. Benedito accepted the donation with humility, knowing it came accompanied by the responsibility of being an example for future generations. The years from 1900 to 1930 brought prosperity to the entire region. The railroad reached the village, facilitating the flow of coffee production. Processing factories were installed, bringing jobs and modernization. Benedito adapted to the new times without losing his essence, investing in modern equipment but maintaining the sustainable methods he had learned from Zeferino. An English coffee company tried to buy his lands in 1925, offering a fortune that would have made him one of the richest men in the region. Benedito received them courteously, served them coffee from his own production, and then politely refused. "Some things have no price," he explained to the British representative. "This land is a fulfilled promise. I cannot sell it." In 1930, at 55 years old, Benedito was respected as one of the most upright colonels in the region. He never used the title, preferring to be called simply Mr. Benedito, but his word was worth as much as a signed document. It was on a golden December afternoon that he gathered his 7 grandchildren on the house porch, children of Maria das Dores, who had grown strong and healthy in the Blessed Valley. The eldest, Sebastião, bore the great-grandfather's name and was 12 years old, the same age Benedito had been when he conquered the land. "I'm going to tell you a story," began Benedito, his voice carrying the sweet weight of years. "It's the story of a promise, a barefoot boy, and how dignity can move mountains." As he spoke, the sun set over the coffee plantations, gilding the red earth and making the spring shine as it continued flowing crystal clear between the stones. On the porch of the big house, Isabel, now a lady with white hair, also listened to the story she knew by heart but never tired of hearing. When Benedito finished, little Sebastião asked, "And the spring, Grandpa? Will it keep flowing forever?" Benedito smiled, the same smile that had won a colonel's heart 46 years before. "It will, my boy. As long as there are people to care for it with love and respect, it will keep flowing. And you will learn to be guardians of that water, as I learned, as my grandfather learned." Night fell gently over the spring valley, and the stars reflected in the flowing water like eternal promises written in the sky. The story had completed a perfect circle, but Benedito knew it was also a new beginning. Future generations would be born on that blessed land, would grow drinking from the same spring, and would learn that some inheritances are more precious than gold, the given word, preserved dignity, and the love that transforms simple promises into eternal legacies. The winter of 1931 came with unusual frosts that painted the coffee plantations of the Spring Valley white. Benedito, now 56 years old, walked among the plants protected by straw blankets, his expert hands checking the damage from the cold. Beside him, grandson Sebastião observed every movement with the attention of a dedicated disciple. "The land is like an elderly lady, boy," explained Benedito, his words forming vapor clouds in the cold air. "When it ages, it needs more care, more affection. But in return, it gives us flavors that only experience can create." Maria das Dores, at 54 years old, remained as elegant as on her wedding day. Her hair, now speckled with silver strands, was gathered in an elaborate bun, and her hands continued magical at transforming common fabrics into dresses worthy of princesses. That morning, she prepared peaky preserves while watching husband and grandson through the kitchen window. The peace of the morning was interrupted by the arrival of an unknown carriage. It was a modern vehicle, with rubber wheels and fine leather finishing, pulled by 2 Arabian horses that stepped elegantly on the packed earth road. From the car descended a man of approximately 40 years, dressed in a cashmere suit and silk tie. He carried a leather briefcase and a smile that tried to appear friendly, but couldn't hide a certain greed in his eyes. "Good morning," he greeted, removing his hat. "I am Antonio Cavalcanti, representative of the Central Bank of Rio de Janeiro. I am looking for Mr. Benedito dos Santos." Benedito approached slowly, his boots making small sounds on the frozen ground. There was something about the visitor that bothered him, perhaps the way the man's eyes assessed everything around, as if mentally calculating prices. "I am Benedito. How can I help you?" Cavalcanti opened the briefcase and removed carefully organized documents. "I come to make you an extraordinary proposal, Mr. Santos. The bank represents a group of investors interested in productive lands. We are willing to pay 500 contos de reis for your property." The number echoed in the morning air like distant thunder. It was an astronomical amount, enough money to buy an entire farm in any region of the country. Sebastião, who was listening to the conversation, widened his eyes. He had never seen so much money even in dreams, but Benedito remained impassive, like a rock resisting the tide. "Thank you for the offer," he said simply. "But my land is not for sale." Cavalcanti laughed, genuinely surprised. "Mr. Santos, do you understand what I'm offering? 500 contos de rei. It's enough money to live like nobility in any capital in the world." "I understand perfectly," replied Benedito. "And I also understand that some things have no price." The banker put away the documents with nervous movements. "Well, I'll leave my card. When you change your mind, you can find me at the Central Hotel in the village." After the carriage departed raising dust, Sebastião looked at his grandfather with mixed curiosity and admiration. "Why didn't you sell, Grandpa? With that money we could buy 10 lands like this one." Benedito sat on a fallen log and pulled his grandson close to him. "Feel the earth, boy. Feel how it breathes beneath your feet." Sebastian closed his eyes and remained quiet for a few moments. "Now tell me," continued Benedito, "if you bought another land with that money, would it have the spring that fed your great-grandfather Sebastião? Would it have his work sweat? Would it have Colonel Firmino's fulfilled promise?" The boy slowly shook his head. "No, Grandpa." "Then you understand why this land is unique in the world. It's not worth 500 contos, nor 1,000 contos, nor all of King Solomon's gold. It's worth our family's honor." That afternoon, Benedito visited Isabel at the big house. The former enemy-turned-friend was now 63 years old, but retained the natural elegance that had always characterized her. A widow for 12 years, she had dedicated herself to educating her grandchildren and charity work in the village. "I heard about the banker's visit," she said, serving coffee in fine porcelain cups. "The news has already spread throughout the region." "News flies faster than birds," agreed Benedito. "But some decisions are easy to make." Isabel smiled, a smile full of affection and admiration. "You continue being the same boy who appeared here 47 years ago, holding a yellowed letter and dignity greater than mountains." "Time changes many things," reflected Benedito, "but some remain the same. The given word, respect for the memory of those who have gone, responsibility to future generations." While they talked, Isabel's children arrived for afternoon tea. João, now 42 years old, administered the farm with competence and honesty. Rita, at 40, had married a doctor from the capital, but visited her mother regularly. Antonio, at 38, had become an engineer and worked in the construction of new railroads. "Uncle Benedito," said João, using the affectionate treatment he had adopted since childhood, "everyone is talking about the bank's offer, 500 contos de reis. And everyone must think I'm crazy for refusing," laughed Benedito. "On the contrary," Rita interjected, her eyes shining with sincerity. "They think you're the last man of honor in a region full of opportunists." Antonio, always the most practical of the brothers, asked a question that was on everyone's mind. "But what if they return with even higher offers? What if they pressure in other ways?" Benedito became serious for a few moments. "Then they will discover that dignity also has strength to defend itself." When he returned home at dusk, he found Maria das Dores and Sebastião talking on the porch. The youngest granddaughter, Rosina, was playing with corn dolls on the veranda, and her silvery laughter echoed like music among the trees. "Benedito," said Maria das Dores, her voice carrying maternal concern, "I've been thinking about this bank business. I don't like the way that man looked at our property." "Neither do I," agreed Sebastião. "It was as if it were already his." Benedito sat in the rocking chair he had made years before, the same one where Donna Rosa used to spend her afternoons. "You're right to worry," he said. "Men like Cavalcanti don't give up easily, but they also don't usually understand that there are values stronger than money." That night, while the family slept, Benedito remained awake on the porch, watching the stars and listening to the constant murmur of the spring. It was as if the water sang an ancient song, reminding him of all the generations that had drunk from it, of all the dreams that had been watered by its crystalline waters. Somewhere in the stars, he knew, were Donna Rosa and Sebastião, Colonel Firmino and Ignacio, all watching and approving his decisions. The land was not just property, it was a sacred link connecting past and future, a promise that transcended generations. And as night embraced the spring valley with its mantle of peace, Benedito smiled, knowing that, whatever happened, some battles were already won in the heart before even being fought in the world. The days following Cavalcanti's visit were marked by a subtle tension that spread through the region like invisible smoke. Benedito noticed conversations that stopped when he approached, strange looks during Sunday masses, and an almost imperceptible change in the way some neighbors greeted him. Zeffirino, now 62 years old, and still vigorous despite his completely white hair, brought worrying news from his walks through the village. "They're saying strange things out there, compadre," he murmured one morning while helping Benedito fix a fence. "That you're harming the region's development, that it's selfishness to keep so much good land just for yourself." Benedito hammered a nail with more force than necessary. "And who's spreading these ideas? Cavalcanti is talking to everyone, offering money to whoever helps him convince you. Some are listening with great interest." That afternoon, the first concrete pressure manifested itself. The village's new mayor, Colonel Teixeira, a man who had bought the title with coffee money and political influence, appeared at the property accompanied by a clerk and an air of authority. "Benedito," he said, without greeting ceremonies, I came to inform you that the municipality is studying the possibility of expropriating your lands for the public good. Expropriation? Benedito couldn't hide his surprise. Why? The region needs to modernize. We have plans for a road that will cut through your property, and the spring could be better utilized with the construction of a municipal reservoir. Benedito looked at the clerk, a nervous young man who avoided his gaze, then back to Teixeira. Can I see these plans? They're still under study, the mayor replied evasively, but when they're ready, you'll be officially notified. After the men left, Sebastião approached his grandfather, his fists clenched with rage. This is unfair, Grandpa. They can't just take our land. Benedito placed his hand on his grandson's shoulder. They can try, boy, but between trying and succeeding, there's a greater distance than that between Earth and stars. The following week, other problems began to emerge. The village bank, run by a friend of Teixeira's, refused to renew a small loan that Benedito used to buy seeds. The merchant who had always bought his corn and bean production suddenly became unavailable for new business. But it was Isabel who brought the most worrying news. She arrived on a rainy afternoon, her face pale and her eyes full of indignation. Benedito, I need to tell you something terrible, she said, still at the doorway dripping rainwater. I happened to overhear a conversation between Cavalcanti and some men in the village. Maria das Dores brought a towel and hot coffee, while Benedito patiently awaited the continuation. They're planning to force a situation where you have no choice but to sell. They'll isolate you commercially, create bureaucratic difficulties, and if none of that works... Isabel hesitated. Tell me everything, Donna Isabel. They spoke of creating an incident that would justify more drastic intervention. The silence that followed was dense as the air before a storm. Sebastião clenched his fists. Maria das Dores brought her hand to her heart, and Benedito remained motionless, processing the implications of the information. An incident, he repeated, his voice low but firm. What kind of incident? I'm not sure, but I heard mention of problems with the spring, public health issues, maybe even what? Even accusations that you would be preventing others from using the water. Benedito got up and walked to the window, watching the rain falling on his coffee plantations. Each drop was like a tear from the earth, and he remembered other storms he had faced. Thank you for warning me, Donna Isabel. The information is worth more than any treasure. What are you going to do? Benedito turned to her, and in his eyes was a determination that Isabel knew well. I'm going to do what my grandfather Sebastião taught me. Protect what's mine with honesty, but without weakness. The next morning, Benedito took his first precautions. He rode to the provincial capital and sought lawyer Dr. José Bento, now a gentleman with white hair, but a mind still sharp as a razor. My dear Benedito, said the lawyer after hearing the whole story, we're facing a delicate situation, but you have rights that not all the money in the world can buy. Dr. José Bento prepared a series of documents reaffirming Benedito's legal ownership, officially registering the spring as private property, and creating legal safeguards against unjustified expropriation attempts. More importantly, he explained, I'm going to write letters to my colleagues in other districts, creating a network of legal support. If they try something irregular, the entire region will know. Back at the farm, Benedito gathered the neighboring small farmers who depended on the spring for their properties. They were 8 families who had prospered, drinking from the same crystalline water. Friends, he said, standing under the shade of a flowering ipe, you know that our spring is threatened, not by droughts or plagues, but by human greed. João Almeida, one of the oldest farmers, stood up. What do you want us to do, Mr. Benedito? This water has fed our children since they were born. I want you to understand that defending this spring is not just defending my property. It's defending your right to have clean water for your families. One by one, the men stood up and extended their hands to Benedito in a gesture of support that was worth more than all the contracts in the world. Together we are stronger, said Benedito. Separated, we are easy prey for those who have more money than character. That night, while Maria das Dores sewed by lamplight and Sebastião studied books borrowed from Isabel, Benedito sat down to write a letter. It was addressed to the capital's newspaper, narrating his story and denouncing the pressures he was suffering. The letter ended with words that would become famous years later. We fight not just for land or water. We fight for the right to honor the promises of those who have gone, for the right to leave something worthy for those who will come. If we give in to the pressures of those who want to turn everything into merchandise, we will not be losing just our property. We will be losing our soul. When the letter was published a week later, Benedito's story spread throughout the province like wildfire. Support letters arrived from distant places, and suddenly the barefoot boy who had collected on a promise had become a symbol of resistance against greed. But Benedito knew that the real battle had only just begun. Out there, in the darkness beyond the lamplight, other storms were approaching, and he would need all his strength, all his wisdom, and all his faith to protect not just the land he loved, but the values it represented. The publication of the letter in the capital's newspaper provoked a reaction that not even Benedito could have imagined. In a few days, the small village in the interior of Minas Gerais became the center of a controversy that had reached the halls of the federal capital. Journalists arrived daily to learn about the story of the boy who became a colonel without losing his dignity. Telegraph operators worked late transmitting news to Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. The central hotel, where Cavalcanti had lodged with such confidence, now buzzed with reporters, lawyers, and curious visitors from afar. Benedito received visitors on the house porch, always accompanied by Maria das Dores, who served coffee and homemade sweets while he answered questions with the serenity that had become his trademark. "How do you feel being called a symbol of resistance?" asked a young reporter, his notebook already full of notes. "I don't see myself as a symbol of anything," replied Benedito, slowly rocking in the chair he had made himself. "I'm just a man who learned from his grandfather the importance of keeping promises and honoring one's given word. But don't you fear retaliation from the economic groups interested in your lands? I fear more disappointing the memory of those who came before me than angering those who only think about profit." Benedito's words, transcribed in newspapers, touched hearts throughout the country. Support letters arrived daily, from farmers who had lost their lands to speculators, from workers who admired his courage, from intellectuals who saw in him an example of authentic values in an era of transformation. But not everything was roses. Cavalcanti and his associates also mobilized. They hired powerful lawyers, bought newspaper space to present their version of the story, and intensified political pressure. It was on a September afternoon that the situation reached its most critical point. Sebastião ran to the house breathless, his eyes wide with fright. "Grandpa, Grandpa," he shouted, even before reaching the porch. "There are strange men tampering with the spring." Benedito jumped up, and for the first time in years his serenity gave way to controlled but evident fury. He walked quickly to where the crystalline water bubbled, followed by Maria das Dores, Sebastião, and several neighbors who had heard the shouts. 5 unknown men, dressed as technicians, were tampering with the spring's bed with measuring instruments. One of them was collecting water samples in bottles, while others made notes on clipboards. "What are you doing on my property?" asked Benedito, his voice firm but controlled. The man who seemed to be the group's leader raised his eyes without showing any embarrassment. "Sanitary inspection," he replied curtly. "We received reports that this spring might be contaminated, posing risks to public health." "Reports from whom?" "That's confidential. But we have authorization from the municipality to conduct the inspection." Benedito observed the men working and noticed something that made him even more alert. Instead of simply collecting samples, they seemed to be altering something in the spring's bed. "Stop immediately," he ordered. "Until I see the official authorization, nobody touches anything here." The group's leader laughed with disdain. "You cannot prevent an official inspection, Mr. Santos. If you try, you'll be accused of obstructing justice." It was then that a familiar voice was heard behind Benedito. "Unless he's accompanied by someone who understands law." Everyone turned to see Dr. José Bento walking toward the group, followed by 2 assistants carrying document folders. The lawyer had traveled specially from the capital upon learning of the threats. "Dr. José Bento," the technician's leader greeted, his arrogance visibly diminishing. "May I see the authorization for this inspection?" asked the lawyer, extending his hand. The man hesitated, then handed over a paper that Dr. José Bento read carefully. "This authorization is irregular," he declared after a few minutes. "It doesn't specify the type of contamination reported, doesn't identify the complainant, and was signed by an official who lacks the competence to issue it." "Technical irregularities," the technician began to protest. "They're not technical irregularities," interrupted Dr. José Bento. "They're illegalities. And if you continue with this work without proper authorization, I'll prosecute you for property invasion and environmental damage." The group of technicians withdrew, grumbling, but Benedito knew they would return with other methods. Dr. José Bento confirmed his suspicions. "They weren't just collecting samples, Benedito. I saw them spill something into the spring, probably some substance to contaminate the water and justify later intervention. That night, Benedito, Dr. Jose Bento, and the neighbors met at João Almeida's house to plan a defense strategy. By lamplight, the grave faces reflected the seriousness of the situation. "They'll try everything," explained Dr. Jose Bento. "Water contamination, bureaucratic problems, political pressure, maybe even physical intimidation. Then we need to be smarter than them," said Zeferino, his voice hoarse but determined. "And more united." It was João Almeida who suggested the idea that would change the course of events. "Why don't we make the spring community property? If it officially belongs to all of us, it will be harder for them to attack." Dr. Jose Bento became thoughtful. "Interesting. A cooperative society of water users. Benedito would continue being the landowner, but the spring would be collectively managed. It would be an interesting legal precedent." Benedito looked around the table, seeing in his friends' faces the same determination he felt in his own heart. "Make the documents," he said. "Water has always belonged to everyone. It's time to make that official." In the following days, Dr. Jose Bento worked tirelessly to create the province's first spring users cooperative. The document was signed by Benedito and the 8 farmers, creating a legal precedent that would be studied in law schools decades later. The news of the cooperative's formation spread quickly, inspiring other rural communities to organize similarly. Cavalcanti and his associates, realizing they had underestimated the resistance, began to reconsider their tactics. But the battle was far from over. In the capital, powerful forces were moving, and Benedito knew he would have to use all his wisdom and courage to protect not just his land, but the example he had become for the entire country. As he watched the spring flow placidly under starlight, he whispered a prayer of gratitude for the friends he had found, and a plea for strength for the battles yet to come. Dignity had found allies, but greed never rests. The autumn of 1932 arrived painting the coffee plantation leaves with golden and red tones, but the season's beauty contrasted with the tension that grew like a storm cloud over the spring valley. Benedito, now 57 years old, watched through the kitchen window the suspicious movements he had noticed in recent days. Unknown men prowled the boundaries of his property, some posing as travelers, others as merchants interested in regional lands. But Benedito, who had learned to read human intentions with the same precision with which he read weather signs, knew they were Cavalcanti's spies, mapping every inch of his land. Maria das Dores, always attentive to details that escaped masculine eyes, brought worrying information from the village market. "The women are whispering strange things," she told him, arranging her hair, which now bore many silver strands. "They say you're becoming stubborn in old age, that you're harming the region's progress." "And what did you respond?" asked Benedito, polishing a boot with more attention than necessary. "That stubbornness is sometimes just another name for dignity, and that progress built on dishonesty is not progress, it's destruction." Sebastião, now 13 years old and growing strong like the great-grandfather whose name he bore, entered the kitchen carrying a note. "A boy from the village delivered this for you, Grandpa." Benedito opened the paper and frowned. It was an invitation, written on elegant letterhead, for a dinner at Colonel Teixeira's house that very night. "An invitation," he murmured, "or a summons." Maria das Dores read over her husband's shoulder. "Are you going?" "I am." "It's better to know what kind of storm is forming than to be caught by surprise." That night, Benedito wore his best suit, a black alpaca jacket that Maria das Dores had sewn with special care years before. His leather shoes shone like mirrors, and his tie was knotted with the precision of one who had learned that sometimes appearance is the first line of defense in certain battles. Colonel Teixeira's house was in the village center, an imposing 2-story construction with well-tended gardens. When Benedito arrived, he found a gathering that made him immediately understand the nature of the trap. Besides Teixeira, present were Cavalcanti, 2 men who introduced themselves as investors from São Paulo, the village's new police chief, curiously appointed just 2 weeks before, and the substitute priest, old Father Antonio, had been transferred to a distant parish. "Benedito," Teixeira greeted with exaggerated enthusiasm, "how good that you accepted our invitation. Come meet these distinguished gentlemen." Dinner was served on silver dinnerware with imported wines and elaborate dishes, but Benedito barely touched the food, focused on deciphering his host's true intentions. The conversation began cordially, talking about the weather, harvests, news from the capital, but gradually, like a river changing course, it directed itself toward the night's true objective. "Benedito," said one of the São Paulo investors, a thin man with small, intelligent eyes. "We need to talk about this region's future." "I'm listening." "Progress is inevitable, my dear fellow. The railroad needs to expand. Electrification will arrive soon, and there are plans for a coffee processing factory that could employ hundreds of people." "Those are interesting plans," agreed Benedito. "And what does this have to do with me?" Cavalcanti leaned forward, his gold rings catching the candlelight. "Your property is located exactly at the center of all these enterprises. Without it, nothing can be realized." "I understand. And if I continue refusing to sell?" The silence that followed was heavy as lead. The police chief cleared his throat. The substitute priest adjusted his cassock, and Teixeira filled his wineglass for the third time. It was the second São Paulo investor who responded, his voice low but loaded with threat. "Then you'll discover that there are many ways to make a landowner's life complicated. Tax problems, documentation issues, banking difficulties, perhaps even personal security matters." Benedito slowly placed his fork on the plate and looked around the table. In his eyes was a calm that his adversaries mistook for resignation. "Gentlemen," he said, his firm voice echoing in the silent room, "I appreciate the hospitality and frank conversation. Now allow me to be equally frank with you." He rose from his chair, imposing despite the simplicity of his manner. "You seem to think I'm a simple man from the interior, easily intimidated by threats and pressure. Perhaps I am simple, but I'm not foolish. And perhaps you have money and influence, but there's one thing you don't have." "And what would that be?" asked Cavalcanti, a note of irritation in his voice. "The truth on your side, and you'll discover that truth, when it has deep roots, is stronger than any storm." Benedito made a small bow. "Good evening, gentlemen. And thank you for helping me understand exactly the type of people I'm dealing with." He left the house, under the surprised and furious gaze of those present, but maintained his firm pace until well out of their sight. Only then did he allow his hands to tremble slightly with the confrontation's adrenaline. On the way home he crossed paths with Isabel, who was returning from visiting a sick family in the village. She stopped the carriage and descended, immediately noting the tension in Benedito's face. "What happened?" Benedito told about the dinner and the veiled threats. Isabel listened in silence, and when he finished, she was pale. "Benedito, these men are dangerous. I knew the type in Saint Jean del Rey. They're capable of anything to get what they want. Then we'll have to be capable of anything to protect what's ours," he replied. "We?" Benedito looked at the woman who had been his enemy and had become his most faithful ally. "You don't need to get involved in this, Donna Isabel. You've already done more for me than I could ask." Isabel raised her chin with the pride that Benedito had known since childhood. "My dear Benedito, haven't you understood yet? This is no longer just your fight. Here it's the fight of all of us who believe that some things are more important than money." That night at home, Benedito gathered the family and told about the evening's events. Maria das Dores listened with growing concern, Sebastião with growing indignation. "What are we going to do, Grandpa?" asked the boy. Benedito looked through the window at the spring that gleamed under the full moon. "We're going to do what we've always done, boy. We're going to honor our word, protect our family, and trust that justice, even if delayed, always finds its way." But within his heart, Benedito knew that the coming months would test not just his courage, but his own definition of how far a good man can go to protect what he loves. The forces against him were powerful, but he had something they didn't understand. Land watered with honest sweat, loyal friends, and the blessing of all the ancestors who had lived and died honorably in that blessed valley. The true war was about to begin. The winter of 1932 arrived more rigorous than usual, bringing frosts that painted the coffee plantations white and a chill that penetrated to the bones. But the natural cold was nothing compared to the frigid climate of hostility that had settled between Benedito and the forces conspiring against him. The first retaliations were not long in coming. The village bank abruptly cancelled all loans granted to the farmers who supported Benedito. The tax collector appeared with a miraculous revaluation that quintupled the tributes on the valley property. And the new police chief began making frequent rounds, always finding small infractions that resulted in increasingly larger fines. But Benedito was not alone. Dr. José Bento had mobilized a network of lawyers who worked for free, questioning each legal irregularity. Journalists continued visiting the property, documenting each pressure and intimidation attempt, and most importantly, the local community had united around his cause. Isabel became his most ardent defender, using her social influence to gain support among the region's traditional families. Her children also got involved. João organized the smaller farmers, Rita mobilized the village women, and Antonio used his engineering knowledge to technically document the spring's importance. It was on a cold July morning that the situation took an unexpected turn. Sebastião ran to the house with a telegram that had arrived from the federal capital. "Grandpa, there are important people who want to come here." Benedito read the telegram twice before believing what his eyes saw. It was signed by a federal deputy, member of the Chamber's Agriculture Commission, requesting permission to visit the property and personally learn about the Spring Valley situation that had attracted the attention of the National Congress. "It seems our story has reached farther than we imagined," said Maria das Dores, reading over her husband's shoulder. Dr. José Bento, who now maintained a temporary office in the village to closely follow the case, was euphoric with the news. "This is exactly what we needed. Political attention at the national level. They'll think twice before using irregular methods with Brasilia's eyes on them." The visit was scheduled for the first week of August. Benedito prepared as if receiving royalty, but without losing his natural simplicity. The house was painted, the garden weeded, and Maria das Dores prepared traditional sweets that filled the house with aromas of cinnamon and cloves. The deputy arrived in a convoy of 3 automobiles, modernity that attracted the attention of the entire village. He was a man in his 50s, of elegant bearing but simple manners, who greeted Benedito as if they were old friends. "Mr. Benedito Santos," he said, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to personally meet the man whose story has moved all of Brazil." "The pleasure is mine, Deputy. Welcome to our humble property." The visit lasted 3 hours. The deputy toured every inch of the land, drank from the spring, talked with neighbors, examined historical documents, and listened attentively while Benedito told the story of the deathbed promise. "Impressive," he murmured, watching the crystalline water bubble from the stones. "In Brasilia we deal with laws and regulations. Here I'm seeing the practical application of justice." When he said goodbye, the deputy firmly shook Benedito's hand. "You can be sure that your story will not be forgotten in the corridors of power, and that irregular actions against your property will be personally investigated by me." The visit's repercussion was immediate. Newspapers throughout the country reported the National Congress's interest in the case, and suddenly Cavalcanti and his associates found themselves exposed to public scrutiny they hadn't expected, but they didn't surrender easily. If they couldn't use obviously illegal methods, they would turn to a more subtle war of attrition. It was Isabel who discovered the new strategy during a social gathering at friends' houses in the capital. "They're spreading rumors about you," she told Benedito during a visit. "They say you got rich illicitly, that you have suspicious business, that the spring is being used for smuggling." "Smuggling?" Benedito almost laughed. "Of what?" "It doesn't matter. The objective is to create an aura of suspicion, making people question your character." But the adversary's strategy encountered resistance they didn't expect. The local community had known Benedito for decades, and the defamation attempts found infertile ground among those who had witnessed his honesty day after day. More than that, the attacks against his reputation generated an even stronger support movement. Letters arrived daily from throughout the country, from farmers who had lost lands to speculators, from workers who admired his resistance, from intellectuals who saw in him a symbol of authentic Brazilian values. The local newspaper, which had initially been neutral, began publishing favorable articles after its editor received economic pressure to attack Benedito. The substitute priest, after initially cooperating with Teixeira, switched sides when he realized his parishioners massively supported the Valley Colonel. It was on a September afternoon that news arrived that would definitively change the course of events. Zeferino appeared running despite his 73 years, with a telegram that brought not just good news, but revolutionary news. "Compadre," he said, breathless but exultant. A telegram arrived from Rio de Janeiro. Benedito read the document and for a moment was speechless. It was from the Ministry of Agriculture, informing that the Spring Valley Water Users Cooperative had been selected as an experimental model for the new community management policy for water resources. Along with official recognition came government funding for infrastructure improvements and the designation of the spring as National Heritage Water Resource. "What does this mean?" asked Sebastião, noting his grandfather's emotion. "It means, boy, that our spring is now under protection of the Brazilian government. It means that whoever tries to harm it will have to deal with Brasilia. That night, Benedito's house filled with neighbors, friends, and supporters celebrating the victory. Isabel brought French champagne she had been saving for special occasions. Dr. José Bento made a speech about the legal precedent that had been established. And Zeferino, the ex-slave who had become one of the best friends Benedito had ever had, spoke words that summarized everyone's feeling. Sometimes justice is slow, but when it arrives complete. Benedito, standing on the porch where Donna Rosa used to spend her afternoons, looked over the land he had defended with such determination. The spring flowed under starlight, its crystalline water reflecting the sky like a liquid mirror of eternity. Somewhere in the distance, he knew, Cavalcanti and his associates were reconsidering their strategies, perhaps even abandoning their plans. But for Benedito, the true victory was not in defeating opponents. The true victory was in proving that a simple man, armed only with dignity and support from true friends, could face the greatest forces and win through honesty and persistence. The spring of 1933 arrived with abundant rains that filled the spring to the brim and made the coffee plantations bloom with an exuberance not seen in years. It was as if the earth itself celebrated Benedito's victory, offering its most generous gifts to one who had defended it with such love. Benedito, now 58 years old with a few more wrinkles marking a face that remained noble and serene, watched preparations for the official inauguration of the Hydrological Studies Center that would be built near the spring. The project, financed by the federal government, would transform the region into a model of sustainable water resource management. Agronomy and engineering students would come from universities throughout the country to study the cooperative system that had been born there. The small village in the interior of Minas Gerais was transforming into a knowledge center, exactly the type of progress Benedito had always dreamed of, growth that respected traditions and benefited the entire community. It was on a golden October morning that Maria das Dores announced an unexpected visit. "There's a man at the gate asking to speak with you," she said, her voice carrying intrigued curiosity. "He says his name is Cavalcanti." Benedito raised his eyes from the letter he was reading, an invitation to participate in a congress on sustainable agriculture in the federal capital, and for a moment remained silent. "Cavalcanti is here?" "He himself, but he seems different, more humble." Benedito walked to the porch and saw the man who had been his main adversary for almost 2 years. Cavalcanti was visibly thinner, his attire simple instead of luxurious, and there was something in his posture that spoke of defeat and perhaps even repentance. "Mr. Santos," said Cavalcanti, removing his hat in a respectful bow, "could you grant me a few minutes of conversation?" Benedito descended the steps slowly, studying the man who had tried to destroy his life. In his own eyes was curiosity, but no trace of rancor. "You may speak. First, I want to apologize for the pressures, for the threats, for the methods I used. They were unworthy." "And what made you change your mind?" Cavalcanti looked at the spring that gleamed in the morning sun, then back to Benedito. "Life, Mr. Santos. Life has a way of teaching hard lessons to those who forget that there are values more important than profit." Benedito gestured for them to sit on the porch. Maria das Dores brought coffee and biscuits, then withdrew discreetly. "My daughter became ill," continued Cavalcanti, his voice laden with emotion. "A fever that the capital's doctors couldn't cure. I spent a fortune on treatments, but nothing worked. And an old retired doctor told me about a healer in the interior of Minas who had a reputation for curing impossible fevers. I didn't believe much, but I was desperate." Benedito began to understand where the conversation was leading. The healer lived in a simple little house, lived on practically nothing, but had wisdom worth more than all the medical books I knew. She saved my daughter with teas from plants she cultivated herself. "And that made you think?" "That made me understand that I had spent my entire life valuing the wrong things. Money, power, influence. But when my daughter was dying, none of that was any use." Cavalcanti took a sip of coffee and sighed deeply. "I began investigating your stories, Mr. Santos, not to harm you, but to understand what type of man had defeated me so completely." "And what did you discover?" "I discovered that you never harmed anyone in your entire life, that you helped dozens of families, that you shared your water with those who needed it, that you honored promises even when it cost you dearly." Benedito watched the man speaking, seeing in him something he recognized, the transformation that happens when someone finally understands what really matters in life. "I also discovered that my own partners betrayed me when things got difficult. The money I had saved for years disappeared in bad investments they made without my knowledge. And now? Now I'm starting over, with little money, but perhaps for the first time in life, with a clear conscience. Cavalcanti stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking at the coffee plantations that stretched down the hills. Mr. Santos, I didn't come here expecting forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I came because I needed to look in your eyes and say that I finally understood why you could never sell this land. Why? Because it's not just property. It's history. It's memory. It's a fulfilled promise. It's proof that there are still people who choose to do right even when it's harder. Benedetto stood up and remained beside Cavalcanti, both watching the view that had inspired generations of his family. What do you intend to do now? I'm going to a small town in the interior of São Paulo. A friend offered me work at a rural school, teaching accounting to farmers' children. It's not much, but it's honest. And your family? My wife forgave me. My daughter, cured by the healer, says she prefers having a poor but honest father to a rich but corrupt one. Benedetto extended his hand to Cavalcanti. We all deserve a second chance. And it seems you learned your lesson the hard way. The handshake was firm, and in that moment 2 men who had been enemies met as human beings who had both made mistakes and learned from them. If you ever pass through here again, said Benedetto, you'll be welcome for coffee and conversation. Cavalcanti nodded in gratitude, mounted his modest horse, and departed down the dusty road. Benedetto remained watching until the figure disappeared in the distance, reflecting on the strange turns life takes and how sometimes our greatest adversaries can become our most important teachers. Maria das Dores appeared at his side. Was it a good conversation? It was a necessary conversation, replied Benedetto. Sometimes we need to see our enemies recognizing their errors to fully understand our own worth. The story was approaching its climax, but an even greater moment of revelation still awaited on the near horizon. The year 1934 brought changes that no one could have predicted. Benedetto, now 59 years old, had become a respected figure not just in his region, but throughout the state of Minas Gerais. Government authorities consulted him on sustainable agriculture issues. University professors brought students to learn about the Springs cooperative model, and journalists continued visiting the property to document what they called the miracle of the valley. But it was on a hot March afternoon that a discovery arrived that would forever change his understanding of his family's past and future. Sebastião, now 15 years old and grown strong like the great-grandfather whose name he carried, had developed the habit of exploring every corner of the property. It was during one of these walks that he found, in an old part of the house that served as storage, a wooden chest hidden under piles of old clothes and yellow documents. "Grandpa!" he shouted, running to where Benedetto was examining new coffee shoots. "I found something strange." The chest was small but heavy, made of noble wood darkened by time and closed with a simple latch that gave way easily. When Benedetto opened it, he found a treasure that was not made of gold or jewels, but of something much more valuable: letters, photographs, and documents that told a story he had never known. The first letter was from his grandfather, Sebastião, written shortly before his death, addressed to him. Benedetto trembled as he recognized the handwriting he had seen only a few times when he was still very young. "My dear grandson Benedetto," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means the time has come to know the whole truth about our family and about the land you inherited." With slightly trembling hands, Benedetto continued reading while Maria das Dores and Sebastião approached, curious about the discovery. "What I never told you, boy, is that I was not just Colonel Firmino's foreman, I was also his half-brother." The words hit Benedetto like lightning. He looked at Maria das Dores, who brought her hands to her mouth in shock, then continued reading with growing amazement. "My father, your great-grandfather, worked these lands long before Firmino inherited the property. When he died, he left 2 sons, Firmino, born from marriage to the lady of the big house, and me, born from his love for a humble worker. Firmino always knew the truth and always treated me as a brother, not as an employee." Benedetto had to stop reading for a moment, his mind processing the implications of this revelation. Maria das Dores placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "The land he promised you on his deathbed was not just gratitude for my years of service. It was the part of the inheritance that legitimately belonged to me, and through me to you. The promise was not charity, my grandson. It was justice." Benedetto's hands trembled even more as he continued discovering secrets that had remained buried for decades. "There are more documents in this chest that prove our kinship and our legal right to the land. But I chose never to use these proofs because I believed that conquering something through merit is better than claiming it through birth. I wanted you to earn your place through your own character, not through blood relations. Among the other documents in the chest, Benedito found birth certificates, letters between Firmino and Sebastião confirming their brotherhood, and a will in which Firmino officially recognized Sebastião's legitimacy as heir to part of the property. But perhaps most touching of all was an old photograph showing Firmino and Sebastião standing side by side, both young, both smiling, both clearly sharing much more than a master-employee relationship. That's why, Sebastião's letter continued, when you went to collect on that promise, it wasn't just courage you showed, it was our family's blood crying out for justice. And it was that blood that made Ignacio recognize, even unconsciously, that you had every right to be there. Benedito finished reading the letter with tears streaming down his face. Everything he had believed about his story was being rewritten. His courage in going to claim the land was not just the action of a brave child, it was the family lineage reclaiming what was legitimately theirs. But remember, the letter concluded, that knowing this truth should not change who you are or how you treat others. You conquered this land through your character, your work, and your dignity. Blood only explains why it seemed so natural for you to fight for it. Maria das Dores was the first to speak, her voice soft but firm. This changes nothing, Benedito. You're still the same man I admired and loved. The land is still yours through your own merit. Sebastião, always practical even in emotional moments, had a different concern. Does this mean we're nobility, Grandpa? Benedito laughed, still with tears in his eyes. No, boy. This means we descend from men who knew how to choose honor over privilege, work over inheritance, character over titles. That afternoon, Benedito called Isabel to share the discovery. When she arrived and heard the whole story, her reaction was exactly what he expected. I always suspected something like this, she said, shaking her head with a smile. My father-in-law never treated your grandfather as merely an employee, and when you appeared that day demanding your inheritance, there was something in your bearing that reminded me of my late husband. And does this change anything between us? Benedito, dear friend, we've been family by heart for years. Discovering we're also family by blood just makes our bond official. As they sat on the porch watching the spring flow under the setting sun, Isabel made a suggestion that would prove prophetic. You should use this information wisely, not for personal gain, but to ensure this land remains protected for future generations. What do you mean? Create a family fund. Use your legitimate claim to establish legal protections that will keep speculators away forever. Make this land a legacy that cannot be touched by greed or politics. That night, as Benedito lay in his bed thinking about everything that had been revealed, he realized the discovery was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a new chapter. He had spent his life proving himself worthy of the land. Now he had to prove himself worthy of the responsibility that came with knowing the truth. The boy who had walked barefoot to claim a promise was now a man who discovered the promise was not charity, but birthright. But more importantly, he was a man who had earned that right through every choice he had made since that first brave day. The revelation was complete, but the real test was yet to come, what he would do with this knowledge, and how it would shape the legacy he would leave for future generations. The winter of 1935 enveloped the Spring Valley in a golden tranquility that seemed to bless every inch of that sacred land. Benedito, now 60 years old with completely silver hair, walked slowly among the coffee plantations that prospered as never before. It was an August morning, exactly 51 years after that memorable day when a 9-year-old barefoot boy had appeared at Boa Esperança farm, holding a yellowed letter. Dr. José Bento had worked tirelessly in recent months to create the Benedito Sebastião Foundation, a revolutionary legal entity that permanently protected the spring and surrounding lands. The document, signed in the presence of federal authorities, guaranteed that the property could never be sold or developed for commercial purposes, but would be preserved forever as historical and environmental heritage. Maria das Dores, still elegant at 58 years old, watched her husband from the porch where Dona Rosa had once spent her afternoons. Her eyes, which had witnessed so much love and struggle, shone with quiet pride. Beside her, Sebastião, now a 16-year-old young man, strong and dignified like all the men of his lineage, read aloud a letter that had arrived from the federal capital. To Mr. Benedito Santos, read Sebastião. In recognition of your extraordinary services to the development of sustainable agriculture in Brazil, the President of the Republic has the honor of inviting you to receive the National Order of Agricultural Merit. A medal from the President, murmured Maria das Dores. Who would have thought? Benedito smiled, but his smile was more contemplative than joyful. It's a great honor, he said, but the real medal is there. He pointed to the spring that flowed crystalline among the stones, and in the faces of children who play in this clean water, and in the coffee plantations that grow with the sweat of honest work. Isabel, now a 76-year-old lady but still elegant and lucid, arrived for the Sunday lunch that had become tradition. She came accompanied by children and grandchildren, a large family that had learned to see Benedito not just as neighbor or friend, but as patriarch of an extended family, united by respect and affection. João, now competent administrator of Boa Esperança Farm, brought news that made everyone smile. The cooperative irrigation project was approved by the state government. In 2 years, all properties in the region will be connected by a system that uses our spring as the main source. And the best part, added Rita, who had become a respected teacher, is that the project includes an educational center where children from throughout the region will learn about conservation and sustainable agriculture. Antonio, the family's engineer, had developed an innovative system that would make water distribution more efficient while preserving the spring's natural flow. Your grandfather Sebastião would be proud, said Isabel, looking at Benedito with eyes full of affection. The water he helped preserve is now benefiting hundreds of families. During lunch, served at the large table Benedito had made by hand years before, conversation naturally turned to memories and reflections on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. Tell again the story of the day when you went to claim the land, Grandpa, asked one of the small great-granddaughters. Benedito looked around the table, seeing faces that represented 3 generations united by the same values that had guided him since childhood. The story didn't begin when I walked to the farm, child, he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades. It began when my grandfather Sebastião chose to work with honesty and dignity, even when life was difficult. It continued when Colonel Firmino decided to keep a promise even on his deathbed, and every day we choose to do right, instead of easy. We continue writing that story. As the afternoon sun entered through the windows, illuminating faces that glowed with contentment and pride, Benedito felt a deep sense of completeness. But he knew that true completeness doesn't come from achieving goals, but from knowing that the foundation has been established for future achievements. What are you going to do with the President's medal? Asked Sebastião. I'm going to place it here in the living room, replied Benedito. But not because it makes me important, because it symbolizes that when people choose to do right, even small actions can echo through time and inspire others to do the same. When afternoon approached and guests began to leave, promising to return next week for another family gathering, Benedito walked alone to the spring. The water flowed as always, unchanged by all the drama that had revolved around it over the years. It had been flowing when Sebastião was young, when Firmino made his promise, when Benedito first claimed his inheritance, and when he defended it against all threats. Maria das Dores joined him, as she had done so many afternoons before. Are you happy, my love? I am satisfied, he replied, choosing his words carefully. Happiness is good, but satisfaction is deeper. It's knowing you lived according to your principles, that you honored those who came before, and that you prepared the way for those who will come after. As they watched, Sebastião approached, carrying a folded paper. Grandpa, I wrote something for our school newspaper, about our family history. Do you want to hear? Of course, boy. Sebastião unfolded the paper and began to read. My great-grandfather always said that the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. We are just guardians for a short time, responsible for preserving and improving what we receive for those who will come after us. Today, looking at our spring that has flowed for centuries and will flow for centuries more, I understand what he meant. The promise my grandfather honored wasn't just about land. It was about carrying forward values that make life worth living: honesty, dignity, perseverance, and love for family and community. When Sebastião finished reading, Benedito felt tears in his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude and fulfillment. That's perfect, boy, that's exactly right. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, reflecting like diamonds in the spring's water, Benedito took one last look at everything he had fought to preserve and protect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth and service. But tonight, standing between the water that had nourished his family for generations and the land that would nourish future generations, he knew with certainty that he had fulfilled every promise, to the dead, to the living, and to the unborn. The boy who had walked barefoot to claim an inheritance had become the man who preserved that inheritance for all time. A promise had been kept, justice had been served, and love had triumphed over greed. It was, Benedito thought, as he took Maria das Dores' hand and slowly walked back home, exactly as it should be. The spring would continue flowing, generations would continue growing watered by its crystalline waters, and the story of dignity and courage that began with a deathbed promise would continue inspiring hearts in all ages to come.